Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to History Heights. I'm Gail Macinda. In the United States, we usually call it the Civil War, but back in the 1860s, it was also known as the War Between the States or the Great Rebellion. No matter its name, this war resulted in death and destruction on a scale that is still very difficult to fathom. We'll never have an exact count of the casualties, but the most widely accepted number was about 620,000 soldiers died during that war. Most of them did not die in battle. A staggering two-thirds of them died from disease. For the most part, it was the men who took up arms and fought those battles, but the women, both North and South, were determined to support their soldiers. This is the story of what some Northern women did about it. Although the political tensions leading up to the Civil War had been brewing for some time, the beginning of the war is considered to be April 12th, 1861, when the Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Just 13 days later, on April 25th, about 50 ladies gathered in New York to begin organizing women to care for the fallen soldiers. Their efforts began as the Women's Central Association of Relief for the Sick and Wounded of the Army. The Reverend Dr. Henry Bellows suggested that they should first determine what the government would and could do, then their job would become doing the rest. Bellows led a group of men to Washington and discovered that much more help was needed than they had originally anticipated. With the new information, plus additional help and support, a new organization was formed. Keeping with the common practice of that time to have long-winded titles, the organization was named a Commission of Inquiry and Advice in respect to the sanitary interests of the United States forces. It was better known as the name we call it now, the Sanitary Commission. The military had their doubts that the plan would work. There was concern that volunteers would get in the way. President Abraham Lincoln was initially hesitant about the group too, but gave his approval on June 13th, 1861. It's a good thing he did. The existing government system was only adequate for a few thousand men. No one imagined that soon there would be hundreds of thousands of men needing aid. Reverend Dr. Bellows was named president for the new organization, and along with 20 other members comprised the executive committee. From the beginning, it was clear that the Sanitary Commission would be a volunteer effort and a private relief organization, separate from the government, while working side by side with the military. Their work would be in the areas of diet and nutrition, clothing, tents, transportation, and cleanliness, among others. The commission also asked that women could serve as nurses. In the minds of most soldiers and officers, war meant the actual planning and fighting of battles, not camp life. Many camps were set up solely based on their military requirements, like proximity to a battlefield, or perhaps where another camp had previously existed, rather than by their sanitary needs, such as access to clean water or supply lines. This created major problems. The new Sanitary Commission began their work by sending physicians to military camps to assess the needs of the troops. It was difficult to find men who had the medical background, the willingness, and personal skill to perform these duties without interfering with the activities of the Army. But indeed they found them. After obtaining military clearance, the physicians would make thorough inspections of the camp, including water, ventilation, drainage, security, quality of the tents and clothes, and so forth and so on. The reports came back outlining the immense dangers to the Army due to the ignorance or neglect of sanitary precautions. Much instruction and warning was urgently needed. The Commission wrote and distributed concise instructions for the best means of preserving health in the camp and for the treatment of the sick and the wounded. A special inspection branch was established to look into the condition of the Army General Hospitals throughout the country. By 1862, the size of the Army had now doubled. The population in the hospitals had quadrupled. But the size of the medical staff had not been increased. While the first work of the Sanitary Commission was one of prevention, relief and care soon became the focus and perhaps the most familiar contribution. An auxiliary branch of the Sanitary Commission was formed, known as the Women's Central Association of Relief. As the wants and needs of the Army were made known, the Women Soldiers' Aid Societies filled them. Women from both country and city came forward to work together in local groups. They gathered food, clothes, books, and more, which were delivered wherever they were needed. Sometimes the articles requested by the camps were not available from the government. Other times, the requests were for articles that were not supplied in amounts sufficient for the needs. At first, packages were sent by individual relief societies, but that didn't always work very well. Eventually, all their work and efforts were combined and more efficiently distributed. The sacrifices from the home front were great. They donated blankets, pillows, and other bedding, clothing of all types and sizes, hospital furniture, medical supplies, and massive amounts of food. Women took down their curtains to cut them up and make quilts. They recycled their petticoats into bandages. They gave. Then they gave some more. Relief for the soldiers was provided in other ways, too. Water would be given to soldiers as they marched from one location to another. Clerical help would assist someone get their pay. Letters were written on behalf of the soldiers, or letters received from home were read to the soldiers. Steamships, once used for transport, were fitted for use as hospitals. The Daniel Webster was the first one assigned to the Sanitary Commission on April 25, 1862, with others soon to follow. Government supplies were quickly exhausted, but the Commission continued to send wagon loads of food and supplies to the areas where they were needed. Place names that are familiar to those who recognize the battles of the Civil War: Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Shiloh, Vicksburg. The horrific results of this war were as evident to any Sanitary Commission volunteer as to any soldier fighting in the battlefield. Here's one report from the field by Dr. Cornelius Agnew. He said, "A single item will show the value of our supplies. We have given out over 30 pounds of chloroform within 3 days after the battle. The medical authorities had not 100th part of what was needed, and in many places, important operations were necessarily neglected and life lost. Countless letters and reports continue to describe the heartbreaking lack of supplies and transportation. It fell to the Sanitary Commission to fill those needs and so many more. An account of the Sanitary Commission's work in the summer following the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky, is an example of just how bad things really were. When the news of the battle reached Louisville, 3 wagons and 21 ambulances of supplies headed out. When they arrived, they found no preparation in place for the wounded. There were already 3,000 wounded men there, with more arriving. They were dirty, bloody. Only a few had any bedding of any kind, some whose wounds had not yet been dressed. The surgeons were short-handed, overworked, but they did their best to keep up. By nightfall, still no supplies of any kind had been received by the government. The only things they had were the supplies from the Sanitary Commission, and soon 10 tons more arrived. Not long after, a letter was received. My sincere thanks to the United States Sanitary Commission for their almost invaluable services to my wounded men at Perryville and Stones River. P.H. Sheridan, Major General. At Gettysburg and other places as needed, the Sanitary Commission set up stations under the Department of Special Relief to prepare the sick and wounded for transport. There were tents for housing, storehouses, and offices. A kitchen with cauldrons and stoves would prepare meals around the clock. In some places, cooking cauldrons were built on wheels so they could be rolled onto the field of battle to provide soup to the wounded and the weary. There were tents for the dressing of wounds. As each man was prepared to leave, his wounds would be freshly dressed, his canteen filled with water, and he was given an extra cup of coffee or soup or broth. Temporary homes and smaller buildings called lodges were established for men who were delayed in getting their paperwork and pay. The first was in Washington, D.C. From December of 1862 through September of 1863, a time period of just 10 months, well over 7,000 men came through that home, and well over 330,000 meals were provided. Additional homes were established in Boston, Nashville, Cairo, Memphis, and many other locations. A hospital directory was established to record the names of the sick and wounded soldiers in all the general hospitals of the country. Letters of inquiry about the status of those missing arrived by the thousands. A mother would receive a reply that her son was alive and doing well. Another would find that his son had died. Another is told her son was in a hospital. A young wife was told where to find her husband, and so it went. The news was delivered by letter or in person, whether hopeful or hopeless. 2 nurses' homes, one in Washington and another in Annapolis, were places where women nurses could rest, but they were most frequently used by the wives and mothers of the soldiers who were in nearby hospitals. Some consider this one of the kindest charities of the Sanitary Commission. The United States Sanitary Commission wasn't perfect. Sometimes shipments didn't arrive. Sometimes food supplies were stolen or misappropriated. And not everyone who worked on behalf of the soldiers was willing to take orders from Washington, D.C. Even so, and although it is impossible to know the exact extent of its efforts, estimates are that the Sanitary Commission raised nearly $480 million at today's current value and helped untold thousands of soldiers and their families. It ended its work on July 4th of 1865, with its last official act the following year with the publication of its history. I find the story of the United States Sanitary Commission and all of its volunteers to be heartbreaking, but so inspirational. So much can be accomplished when we work together. We can learn from the past, but we don't live there. Go be awesome today and make your own history. And stick around for another great story like this one. It's about a fundraiser for the Sanitary Commission, and you can thank Mark Twain for that one.